The year is 2021. I have had a few more fantasy series tick away under my belt. And it's reached that time once again where I'm going to update my list of top 10 favorite fantasy series for me to recommend. The problem is, there's not a whole lot here that's going to surprise people. And I know that because, you know, I can only read so many series, I read a lot of standalones, and not every time new series are going to catapult in my top 10. But I still wanted to do something a little different, so I figured what might be a good idea is to actually make this my top 10 sci-fi fantasy series of all time. And I'll do a follow-up list eventually at some point this year of top 10 sci-fi fantasy standalones. I'm going to be a bit quicker on this list, especially for entries that were also on my last top 10 list, so let's get ready to make this a little more of a fly through. But without any further ado, this doesn't need much of an introduction, you get the point. It's my personal top 10 based on my, enjoyment levels, fantasy sci-fi series of all time. Let's go number 10. Well, BOW! And yes, I am holding a tiny Daniel. I like it. At number 10, we have His Dark Materials. I recently reread pretty large chunks of this series, not even for any purpose or review on the channel, just to get back into it as I was watching season 2, and I must say, it was an exquisite experience. I don't know why that was needed. There's a constant conversation around this series and its themes, and deservedly so. It has some of the most nuanced, intricate, and insightful commentaries on portions of our own society and faults within organizations that the fantasy genre has ever seen. But I feel like the talk around His Dark Materials is overly focused on that to the point where people don't mention many other fantastic aspects to Philip Pullman's work. Whether it's his unrivaled ability within the fantasy genre to write child characters that come across very capable, intelligent, yet still childlike, his extraordinarily well-executed romance at the core of it, and his rock-solid friendships that really pull your heart deeper and deeper into this trilogy, which is currently being expanded upon with new books being released in the world. Good on you, Philip Pullman. I'm happy to read those one day. And then, of course, finally, there's the world building itself, and I think this multi-dimensional world-hopping experience is one of the best executions of an idea like that the fantasy genre has seen as well. His Dark Materials, there are criticisms you can have, but as someone who has read this series at multiple points in their life and continually sees new angles to love and enjoy it each time, it does earn the number 10 spot for me, which is not the highest high, but I think it's a classic for a reason. In terms of books I plan to eventually read to my nieces, nephews, what have you, absolutely 100%. This is going to be one I put up right first and foremost to get them into the genre. Ground control to Major Tom. We're talking about number 9 now, over and out. Number 9, we're going to have our first sci-fi entry here, and this is actually going to be a series I started and finished last year and absolutely loved. I've given it to tons of friends and never had anyone say anything but, wow, that was an amazing read and I loved it. And this is going to be Murderbot. Murderbot is somehow a story about an artificial intelligence that suffers from anxiety and depression with this weird, outside yet insightful view into mankind. And it's arguably the most relatable character I read this year as someone who suffers from anxiety and depression. Wow, Murderbot is a fantastic representation of the feelings someone who suffers from those things can have. Martha Wells, to an absolutely exquisite extent, used this Murderbot character as a beautiful example of how to write someone on the outside of society that doesn't fit in and is not actually one of us, to then be an ultimate reflection of how many people in the real world day-to-day life really feel. The only weak area to this series is I don't think a ton of the supporting characters are super well fleshed out, and the world building is lacking, but there's still enough there to definitely intrigue most. But that's not the heart of Murderbot. The heart of Murderbot is Murderbot. And it's all basically a character study of exploring the life, day-to-day thought process and understanding of humanity from this creature that was made for one purpose, and that's a purpose it does not necessarily like. As I've said a million times before, I'm a character reader, and so if you have something like this that's just on such a stupidly high level in execution, I'm just going to admire it. I recommend Murderbot to just about everybody, unless you are a I need the epic always level reader. Aside from that, this is on my must-read list for just universal appeal. I don't see many people reading Murderbot and not at least liking it, because almost everyone recognizes a concept executed well. So even if it's not necessarily your taste, you'll like it on the level of like, that was well done for what was set out to do. Number 8. Number 8. We have the Farseer Trilogy. As is a series I want to get further into. It starts with a trilogy, and then we see Fitz go on more adventures. But boy, oh boy, was the Farseer Trilogy an absolutely beautiful start. And I'm encouraged by people continually telling me it only gets better from here. I stand by what I said in one of my reviews for the Farseer Trilogy, where this series should be called happens to Fitz, and Fitz deals with it and keeps going. This is a protagonist who was put through the ringer for all 3 of the books that I have read, and each time he stands up and you love him all the more for going against the odds he must conquer. He has a villain who's not over the top, they're believably evil, but there's underlying forces at play that definitely elevate all the stakes within the series. You become emotionally invested, not just because of the main character being so well realized, and I believe Fitz is one of the best realized characters I read of last year, yet there's also this added angle where there's so much motivation bleeding out of his page. Robin Hobb made sure that every single person, you understand why they're doing what they're doing. You may not agree with it, but that adds like so much more investment. And it's something I do see lacking in a lot of the fantasy books I read. There's a lot of just evil because evil. And I think maybe the most impressive feature of the Farseer Trilogy is seeing Fitz evolve and grow from the first book to the last. What you see is someone who is different, like fundamentally he has changed due to what he's been through, his maturing, his growing up, yet he still feels like Fitz, and Robin Hobb walks you through every single change with an extreme level of strategy so that you understand how he's becoming the man he becomes. And the only thing you're gonna get frustrated with is sometimes you just want like Fitz to turn into a first law character and just start brutalizing the evil people around him. But he's not going to do that because he's a good person. He's a really good person. At number 7, we have the Greene Saga. Just 2 books, and there's 1 more to go. A whole third of it's not even been released, and it's hitting my number 7 because I found book 1 to be great, and I found book 2 to be borderline perfect. It's a sequel that elevates and enhances with every single word, and absolutely masterclass example in how to pin characters, get us to invest in them, sometimes hate them, yet you love them still. Hilo, Shay, Lan, everyone, this whole cast, they're so, your heart breaks for them continually because this is a story of corruption. Going down the evil path is like a whirlpool. You start in this, yeah, I can do this little things on the outside, but you inevitably get drawn closer to the center. The layers of destruction are so powerful. The draw to being in this crime syndicate family is inevitable. You can't escape once it gets its hooks into you. Shay especially is somebody who I am like just constantly thinking about where her character is going to go. Greene Saga is another one of these that just brings pretty much so much to the table I'm constantly seeing people ask for in their fantasy. And hey, if you want it, pick up these 2 books. It's a crime syndicate fantasy series that isn't world-ending stakes. It's about these families moving against each other. It's clan warfare. It's Yakuza Mafia inspired, and it's just so compelling. The world, that's the one area I can see people not being as interested. This is not a Cosmere, this is not Mistborn type magic system. Though there is a very well-defined magic system laying under this, it's not the focus. Fantasy acts more as a backdrop to be an element to enhance the story you're then enjoying. So if you're a rock solid, I need a Lord of the Rings type fantasy where the mythos drives the plot is driven here by things like Jade, but it almost feels like it's being driven by the economy around the magic rather than the magic itself. So there's, yeah, if you die hard, I need fantasy strong, I could see it being an issue, but overall, Greene Saga, this is maybe my most anticipated book of next year, is the final one, Jade Legacy. I cannot wait for it. If I could get an early review copy, I'd be very, very happy. Next up, we have the closest thing I've ever done to running a marathon, and that is reading Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's an underdog story for me, where I started off kind of just on this series, but with the Crippled God, with its ending, with everything this series accomplishes, it is one of the greatest fantasy series ever written in my mind. The fact that it wasn't in that Times list that came out is a disgrace, in my opinion. I've talked about it a lot recently here on the channel, so I won't spend too much more time on it, but I'll just say that Steven Erikson, in terms of his craft of character, I was wrong. He's one of the best the genre has, in terms of his commentary, in terms of his world building, in terms of his motivation in the pages. The man's another breed. He's something you're not going to come across outside of Erikson. And now we're definitely getting into the territory of the goats of the goats of the goats, the proven, the proven, the proven, the people who are always going to be brought up in the conversations of the best of the best. At number 5, we actually have a series I think has a tremendous amount of appeal overlap with the Greenbone saga, and it's going to be one that I think no one would turn their nose up at you for saying is probably your favorite fantasy series, because it's just so well loved and appreciated, and that's going to be First Law. Joe Abercrombie's work here, what more can I say? I've spent video after video just praising all the different features. There's not weakness here. It's again similar to Greenbone Saga in that it's more fantasy minimalism, it's more the backdrop, and you're focusing a whole lot more on the characters and the story than like a Lord of the Rings where the mythos drives it all. But it's kind of the best example of this kind of fantasy most people I talk to can think of. It's just beautiful. Joe Abercrombie, no one's gonna be mad at me saying, is the best working with character currently in the genre. And I'm just gonna move on because I've said all I need to say about First Law. If you haven't read it yet, what's wrong with you? Okay, if you don't like grimdark, I can get it, because it's definitely grimdark appeal. What did I dropped number 4? Oh look, I got a number 4 here, and that's going to be the Cosmere. Cosmere, I mean, it's Sanderson, right? And he's the current undisputed king of unadapted fantasy. If you look at all the authors who have not had a successful adaptation, Brandon Sanderson sits on top, and his potential, after he gets some rock-solid adaptations, to be as famous and as heralded as a Martin, as a Tolkien, is no doubt there. I mean, if he got a Game of Thrones early season level adaptation of Mistborn, Stormlight Archive, he's going to be propelled to the top tiers of fantasy authors talked about of all time. And the fact that he's already so close to being as well known, as talked about as those guys without an adaptation is just bonkers. And he's earned every inch of it, with some of the most memorable fantasy stories of the 2000s coming out of his pen or computer, I don't know, however he writes a lot of the time. Now we are in the top 3, and we're going to talk about one I've mentioned quite a few times on the channel, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but with number 3, we have the Foundation series. It's the foundation of science fiction in some ways because of how influential it's been. No, Isaac Asimov did not invent modern sci-fi. I would throw that credit to Mary Shelley, but he's someone whose influence is essentially felt in every single sci-fi story that's deemed to have the genre label put on it. If I had to keep one piece of praise though to sell you on the Foundation, I think I would quite simply repeat what I've said before, more so than The Expanse, more so certainly than Dune, more so than really any other sci-fi series I've come across. The Foundation to me lives up to the name space epic. It has a weight, a feel to it that I've never felt before reading anything in the sci-fi genre. At number 2, look at that little 2 right there. That's a good little 2. We have The Lord of the Rings. I'm just gonna go ahead and point you to one of my Lord of the Rings videos, and you can go ahead and watch that if you want to see why I think the series is so freaking amazing and holds up so well after all this time. Moving on. That's a big old 1 right there. But before we get into that, quickly, a few honorable mentions. So I think everyone knows on my list that I defaultly put Wheel of Time at number 0. So number 1 is actually like number 2, and you're actually getting a list of 11. But I've talked about Wheel of Time to the point where it's like there's every piece of praise I could possibly say about it already out in the world. So just keep in mind, that's actually what I'm saying here. But the number 1 for this list is Discworld. It's hard for me to get across as clearly as I want to how much of a masterpiece I think Discworld is. Genuinely, shockingly so. It's not until you'll probably get 5, 6, 7 books into it that you'll realize that Terry Pratchett wrote one of the greatest stories ever. It's a whole world, it's this environment, it's this living, breathing thing. Literally, it's on a bunch of elephants on top of a turtle's back. You could take nearly every bit of praise I've said throughout this list, pick it up, and put it on top of Discworld. Minus some of the, like, the grimdark stuff, because it's not that at all. But you have some of the best characters I've ever come across, some of the most intriguing stories, inventive usages of magic, strongest personality I've ever seen in literature. Like, it's not even close. There's no other literature out there that I have felt the author's hand dance across these pages so playfully and yet never feel intrusive. It is absolutely exquisite. And then you'll have the commentary through comedy. I've always said in my life that some of the best usages of comedy are when it's used to critique us, a society, our thoughts, our ways of life. That's kind of the driving philosophy of Discworld. Yes, it's in this absurdist setting, but it's being used to very much so look at the human condition, our problems, our thoughts, and put forth counters or poke fun at it, which I think a lot of us need in our day-to-day life. Whether it's following the City Watch or Death or some of the more zany one-off stuff, just Discworld as a whole. It's going to touch you in ways that I think books rarely can. It's got that special appeal where it feels so from the heart, so genuine, so well put together. It made me more like nervous to try and write as a wannabe author, because it's like, there's no way I'm gonna ever do a Discworld. It's above and beyond me. This is something special. And again, getting back to those themes of questioning authority, the ways our societies work, power as a whole, as you'll see in the City Watch, or hey, if it's more your style to think about existential ideas, again, flop on over to Death and go through some of his absolutely stunning monologues about our condition, our existence, and the mental toll it would take to be death on a thing. Everyone from across the spectrum has positive things to say about Discworld. It's a truly special series, and it's my number one. But my number 0 is Wheel of Time, because that's actually the greatest thing ever written. And if you disagree with me, I will fight! And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high-tier Patreon, Elizabeth Marie. Hope you're having a great one. Goodbye.